Kerbal Space Program, the long season. Well, starting out this episode, I'm in the research and development lab, choosing what to do with my science, and I end up picking the heavier rocketry. Meanwhile, out at the launch pad, we have another of the training hopper vessels ready to launch, and you may notice this large fairing on the top, and that's because I have decided to go ahead and not only take care of some things with the training hopper, but also take advantage of the extra delta V I get by putting a couple of good sized SRBs on it. This flight will fill several contracts at once. When the vehicle reaches Kerbal orbit, that will fill one contract for a station in Kerbal orbit that can support 5 Kerbals, because the training hopper can easily take care of that. Then we'll get some science from space near Kerbal. That's a second contract. The third and fourth contracts are beneath that fairing in the form of 2 satellites that we'll be putting in position around the moon, keeping my velocity down so that I don't go supersonic below 10 kilometers, not only for aerodynamic reasons, but also because doing that will have at least a reasonable chance of some of the antennas on this vehicle snapping off, because they're not under the fairing. Other than that, the launch goes perfectly fine, and you'll notice I'm using Smart ASS for attitude and so on control during the launch phase. I've taken to doing that because Smart ASS is somewhat easier to deal with than the flight computer for this phase of the flight. On arrival in orbit, as soon as the ship achieves an actual stable orbit, the first of these several contracts is fulfilled as the ship qualifies as a new satellite capable or station capable of supporting 5 Kerbals, and that takes care of the first contract. The second contract is taken care of when I do a crew report from that location, and then I spend some time getting the maneuvers set up to send the ship to Minmus, changing my plane and all that, and then we're on the way. The first part of the launch out to Minmus is, as you would expect, fairly routine, except that in this case I have arranged to come in retrograde at a rather high altitude because one of the satellites needs to be in a high retrograde orbit. Other than that, all very routine the whole way out. I did notice that I did catch myself using Smart ASS for the entire trip out to Minmus, just simply because it's a big habit to use Smart ASS to hold the node for the first part of the burn and then switch to stability assist, stock stability assist, to hold position. You'll notice Smart ASS is turned off through a big chunk of this. As I get close to the end of the maneuver, I throttle down way low so that I can have some control over fine-tuning exactly where the orbit ends up. I didn't want to overshoot by a whole lot. And I get the orbit out to the high retrograde position that I'm wanting it at. And then it's just a matter of set the Kerbal alarm clock for the sphere of influence change and go from there. You'll notice that this is one of those orbits where the game isn't quite sure there's going to be an encounter until it actually happens. Fortunately, it does happen, and once I get into the Minmus sphere of influence, then it's time to switch out there and get the antennas of the first satellite activated and separated. And this is where the remote tech computer comes in big time and gets a lot of action. Once I get the course plotted for the first phase of that satellite's orbit. That's when I go ahead and decide to start setting the other two antennas on the satellite. And I'm confused at first that none of the satellites get connection with it, and then I realize they're not going to until the antennas are actually activated. That taken care of, the satellite is hooked up, and I engage the flight computer to hold maneuver prograde and execute the planned maneuver and set an alarm for the maneuver just in case. And then it's time to separate the decoupler between the two satellites, get the antennas on, at least one of the antennas on it activated and pointed, and get it set up for a maneuver. Now the maneuver I'm setting up for the second satellite, I'm leaving that in as high an orbit as possible that will still actually be in orbit, because that will give me the ability to do the rather serious plane change that I need in order to put it into a polar orbit for the least possible cost in delta V. And then set up a maneuver for the training hopper itself to put it into a moon orbit. What I didn't count on was the fact that the first couple of these maneuvers were kind of overlapping, and I didn't realize that the flight computer would not execute maneuvers if it didn't have focus. And so that resulted in me having to do the best I could with having at least one rather late maneuver. But in the end, it all came out well. From this point, it's just a matter of going back and forth between the two satellites. I set up a maneuver and then set it up in the flight computer, set a Kerbal alarm clock for it so that I don't miss the burn, and then I'd switch to the other one and do the same thing, time warping here and there, switching back and forth between them, doing maneuvers and so on, until finally I get the polar satellite into position, and that fulfills one of the satellite contracts, which makes it the fourth contract fulfilled by this flight. And then from there, the next maneuver on the high orbit retrograde satellite is like 4.5 hours away, which gives me time to switch back to the Space Center and launch another vehicle. Now, for this launch, I'm launching it from the runway, and the reason for that is that I'm trying to enforce a 5-day period between launches, and the launch pad was used about 3 days ago, and so I cannot use it again until day 58, I think it is, or something like that. But I've got a couple or 3 days before I can use the launch pad again, so I decided to go ahead and launch this one from the runway. This is a satellite that is destined for a synchronous orbit around Minmus. One that I wasn't sure that it was actually possible to do that, because Minmus being so small and having such a small gravity well and so on. But that's what the contract calls for. And so I dragged out the Mycroft lifter and put the satellite on it and get this thing going on its way to Minmus. And having taken care of the plane change needed, I get the main burn figured out. And once it gets an encounter with Minmus, I switch the focus to Minmus, as I've learned to do recently. Once you get the encounter, you switch the focus to your target and then use very fine adjustments on the precise node maneuver editor to get the burn set exactly the way you need it to. And that's when I found out that I had forgotten to set the comm dishes on this satellite before doing very much. I had one of them set to ComSat 1, but I flew into the place where it was in shadow of it, out of sight of ComSat 1, and I hadn't set up any of the antennas for any of the other ComSats, so I had to wait and orbit around until I got Comlink again, and then I was able to set up the other dishes to have communications, and then I had to refigure the node, and then finally this thing was set up on its way to Minmus. And so, with the Minmus ComSat finally on its way, I checked and I realized, oh, this is going to take 16 days to fly out there. So, I switched back to the last moon satellite and take care of the last 2 or 3 maneuvers necessary to get it into position exactly in plane and with the AP and PA exactly where the contract called for it, get that taken care of, and then I spend a few minutes making sure that the comm dishes of all the satellites in the moon area are active. Each one has 1 dish pointed to active vessel and 2 dishes pointed to other ComSats, and that includes the item in low moon orbit that originally started out to be the Babylon 1 drive section, because it's got several antennas and solar panels and batteries on it, so I might as well at least use it for a satellite. And that's all taken care of now. So I've ended up fulfilling 4 contracts in 1 launch and getting another launch in gear for what will be the beginning of ComSat network around Minmus, because that's going to be necessary as well. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I am working on a new design for a rover, one that will be very good on Minmus and possibly be quite useful on the moon as well, with the objective in mind to drive and or fly from one biome to the next, picking up all of the science available and bringing it back to be processed in a mobile processing lab. And I'm going to be doing that very soon, because that is going to let me unlock most, if not all, of the rest of the tech tree. The rover design I have in mind is going to feature actually having 3 cockpits. One will be a 2-man cockpit that the pilot will operate. A pilot and an engineer, no, a scientist and an engineer will be aboard. And then the other 2 cockpits are simply so that when I get 500 science worth of stuff, I put it all in one of the separate cockpits so that I can keep things straight as to how much each processing lab is going to be dealing with. And with all this taken care of, we'll be getting to work on the vehicles headed to Minmus very soon. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.